Before we jump into this exciting story, leave a comment below and let us know where you're watching from. Now enjoy the story. Sarah Evans pedaled as fast as she could, her heart pounding. She was almost done with her shift, but this last delivery was taking longer than expected. Come on, she muttered, weaving around a pedestrian who was too busy texting to notice her speeding past. Finally, she arrived at Smith & Associates, a high-end law firm so fancy that even the receptionist looked like she belonged in a luxury perfume ad. As soon as the elevator door slid open, a group of lawyers rushed inside, deep in discussion. They were probably talking about million-dollar deals, not about stretching a paycheck to the end of the month, like Sarah. Slipping in right behind them, Sarah barely made it before the door shut. "Perfect," she whispered. But just as she breathed a sigh of relief, another man stepped in. He was impeccably dressed, with a sharp suit and perfectly styled hair. The elevator suddenly let out a loud, shrill beep. Beep, beep, beep. One of the lawyers glanced at the panel, and his eyes widened. "We've hit the weight limit." The group exchanged glances before one of them turned to Sarah. "Someone needs to step out." Sarah blinked. "Okay, who was the last one to get in?" She looked straight at the sharply dressed man. It was him. He raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised at being called out. "Me? Yes. If someone has to step out, it should be the last person who got in. Basic elevator etiquette." A lawyer beside him murmured, "She's got a point." The man in the suit crossed his arms. "I'm not leaving. I need to get upstairs." Sarah crossed her arms too. "Great. So do I. And my delivery is just as important as your meeting." The lawyers exchanged awkward glances. "Miss, please, just take the next one. It's only a few minutes." "A few minutes could cost me my delivery. Why should I be the one to leave and not him?" She pointed at the suited man again. One of the lawyers sighed. "Because he's Nicholas Smith, the CEO of this firm." Sarah didn't flinch. "So what? CEOs can wait too." Silence filled the elevator. Then Nicholas smirked. "You've got guts." "I've got a job to do. And I have a company to run." A lawyer groaned in frustration before finally stepping out. "There. Now stop arguing." The doors closed, and the elevator began to rise. Sarah glanced at Nicholas. "I bet you got your CEO title by arguing with people until they gave up." Nicholas chuckled. "And I bet you'd make a great lawyer." Sarah scoffed. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" When they reached the 28th floor, the lawyers exited first, ignoring Sarah entirely. Nicholas strode toward his office, while Sarah focused on her delivery. But when she checked the recipient's name, she froze. No way. She took a deep breath, hoping it was a mistake. It wasn't. Knocking on the door, she braced herself for the awkwardness ahead. Nicholas looked up, genuinely surprised. "You again?" Sarah forced a stiff smile. "Yep. Life's little ironies. Here's your food, Mr. CEO who can't wait for an elevator." She set the bag down with just a little more force than necessary. Nicholas held back a laugh. "Looks like we were meant to cross paths today. Or maybe I'm just cursed with bad luck." He studied her for a moment. "You're a great speaker. Ever thought about doing something other than food delivery?" Sarah narrowed her eyes. "Why does everyone keep saying that?" "Because you're quick-witted, sharp, and incredibly bold. That's rare." She hesitated. "I studied law for a bit, but I had to drop out." "Why?" She looked away. "Personal reasons." "Fair enough." Nicholas grabbed a piece of paper, scribbled something, and slid it across the desk. "This is a mock case. An employee was fired without cause. How can they fight it?" Sarah frowned. "You're testing me now." "I'm curious." She rolled her eyes, but couldn't resist the challenge. "It depends on the contract and the length of service. If the termination was without prior notice, the employee may be entitled to compensation under labor law. If there's a specific clause in the contract, they could claim a breach of agreement." Nicholas leaned back, a glint in his eyes. "You have talent." "Was that a test?" "It was. And you passed." She huffed. "Great. Can I go now?" Before she could stand, Nicholas grabbed her insulated food bag. "If you want a better job than delivering food, come to my office tomorrow. Let's talk. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Are you offering me a job? I'm offering you a chance. What you do with it is up to you. She took his card without saying a word and walked out. Nicholas watched her leave, a curious smile playing on his lips. That girl wasn't ordinary, and he wanted to know exactly what she was capable of. Outside the building, Sarah stared at the card like it was a winning lottery ticket. Only instead of millions, the prize was a mysterious opportunity to work alongside a demanding CEO. She sighed. If I keep going at this pace, I'll end up signing a contract without reading the fine print. When she got home, her roommate Mia was lounging on the couch, munching on popcorn while watching a reality show. So, how was your battle with the lawyers? Sarah flopped onto the armchair. I got fired, argued with the CEO, and now he's offering me a job. Mia's eyes widened. Wait, the guy from the elevator? The one and only. Mia blinked. Mia clicked her tongue. If this were a cliché romance, you two would be married by the end of the year. Sarah rolled her eyes, grabbed a pillow, and tossed it at her friend. This is real life, Mia. I just want to pay my bills. Mia smirked. And what are you going to do about that? Sarah glanced at Nicholas's business card, took a deep breath, and made her decision. I think I'll go. I've got nothing to lose. Sarah stood outside the building, inhaling deeply before stepping inside. No delivery bag, no takeout uniform, no lingering scent of fast food. Today, she was dressed as professionally as her budget allowed. A light blue blouse, black pants, and shoes that would probably leave blisters if she walked too much. The receptionist recognized her immediately. You again. Sarah smiled. No crowded elevators this time. The woman chuckled and picked up the phone. Mr. Smith, your guest is here. After a brief pause, she nodded. You can go up. This time, Sarah walked into Nicholas's office with purpose. When the elevator doors opened, no one told her to leave. Nicholas was sitting behind his desk, as if he had expected her to show up. He smiled. Welcome to the office, Sarah. I haven't accepted anything yet. Then why are you here? Sarah crossed her arms. Curiosity. Nicholas raised an eyebrow. Great. Then have a seat. She hesitated, but eventually sat across from him. Nicholas took a file and placed it on the desk. Here's your first challenge. Sarah picked up the document and skimmed through it. Wait, this is a real contract. Yes, and I want you to review it and tell me if anything looks off. She narrowed her eyes. This still feels like a test. Nicholas smirked. Of course it is, but that's how you'll learn. Sarah sighed but grabbed a pen and started reading. Within 3 minutes, she had already marked up several clauses. Nicholas watched, amusement hidden in his expression. Find anything? Sarah looked up. If the contracting party fails to meet the deadline, the penalty fee will be determined at the contractor's discretion based on what is most convenient. She met his gaze. That basically gives the contractor the right to charge whatever they want. Nicholas nodded. And is that legal? Sarah smirked. Legal? Yes. Ethical? Not at all. Nicholas chuckled. I like the way you think. Sarah crossed her arms. So, did I pass the second test? Nicholas stood up and extended his hand. If you accept the job, this will be your daily routine. She hesitated for a second, then shook his hand. I accept, but no coffee runs. Nicholas smiled. We'll see. Sarah was introduced to the office as Nicholas's new assistant, and the murmur started immediately. Is that the girl from the elevator? Yeah, he actually hired her, but she was a delivery girl. Sarah rolled her eyes. Great, my nickname is already set. Nicholas's secretary, Lena, smiled. Don't worry, they'll forget in a few weeks. Sarah snorted. Or remember forever. Lena laughed. Come on, I'll show you where you'll be working. Sarah was led to a desk near Nicholas's office. Here's your space. You can start by organizing these files. She eyed the stack of papers. Is this a punishment? Lena grinned. Nope, just a normal day. Sarah sighed and started reading. 15 minutes later, she had already found 2 serious mistakes. She picked up a pen and began marking the inconsistencies. Nicholas walked by and stopped when he saw her notes. "You've already found errors?" Sarah looked up. "If I'm going to be fired for correcting bad contracts, just let me know now." Nicholas laughed. "Relax. You're doing exactly what I expected." Sarah exhaled in relief. "Good, because I'm already halfway through the second contract." Nicholas watched, impressed. "At this pace, you'll be giving me orders soon." She smirked. "Don't doubt it." Not everyone was happy with Sarah's presence. Hader Reynolds, a senior attorney, had been watching her with suspicion since she arrived. At lunchtime, he finally confronted her. "You know you don't deserve to be here, right?" Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Oh, and who decides that?" "You. I studied for years to be here. You were delivering food last week." She smiled. "And yet Nicholas hired me. What does that say about you?" Hader turned red. "Let's see how long you last." Sarah tilted her head. "If you want to bet, I'm in." At that moment, Nicholas appeared. "If you're done with this ego contest, we have a client waiting." Sarah followed him, a victorious smile on her face. Hader stayed behind, clearly frustrated. But Sarah knew this was just the first of many battles in that office. She was still wrapping her head around the fact that, just a week ago, she was delivering food, and now she was the personal assistant to the CEO of one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. Nicholas walked past her desk with a folder. "Have you finished the contracts I gave you?" Sarah picked up a stack of papers. "If you want me to review them in the dark and with my eyes closed, I can pretend I have." He laughed. "Take this folder. We have a meeting with an important client in 10 minutes. Sarah's eyes widened. "Wait, I'm going to a meeting." Nicholas shrugged. "If you want to learn, you need to see how things work in practice." She grabbed the folder, straightened her posture, and followed him. Even though she wasn't a lawyer, she felt like she belonged here more than some who looked down on her. When they entered the meeting room, a middle-aged man in a dark suit was waiting with a serious expression. He looked at Nicholas, then at Sarah, clearly unimpressed. "Who is this?" Nicholas sat down. "My assistant, Sarah Evans." The man frowned. "Assistant? I was expecting someone more experienced." Sarah crossed her arms. "Funny. I was expecting more polite clients." Nicholas barely suppressed a laugh, while the man's eyes widened. She slid a contract toward him. "Let's get straight to the point, Mr. Martinez. You want to renegotiate the termination clause in your company's contract, correct?" The man narrowed his eyes. "Yes." Sarah smiled. "The problem is, if you do it the way you suggested, you'll be opening the door for others to use the same argument against you. You don't want that, do you?" Mr. Martinez stared at the contract, frowning. Nicholas smirked. "And what's the solution, Sarah?" She circled a section. "Adjust this part here, ensuring that any changes to the termination clause apply only in specific, predefined situations. That prevents loopholes." Mr. Martinez looked at Nicholas. "Has she always been like this?" Nicholas smiled. "Since day one." The man sighed. "I like someone who gets straight to the point. Let's move forward." Inside, Sarah wanted to celebrate. First meeting, and she had already solved a problem before it turned into a lawsuit. Hader crossed his arms and smirked. "Let's see what the delivery girl has to say." Sarah ignored his mocking tone. If the company wants to cancel the contract without paying the penalty, they need to prove there was a serious service failure. But in this case, their documents aren't enough. That means we can argue that canceling the contract without payment is actually a breach of contract. Nicholas smiled. "Exactly." The lawyers exchanged glances, and even Hader looked a little surprised. This could actually work. Nicholas turned to Sarah with a pleased expression. "Well done, Evans. Looks like you're getting the hang of this." She crossed her arms and smirked. "I'm just getting started." Once everyone had left, Nicholas leaned against the table and studied her. "You know you're making some people uncomfortable here, right?" Sarah rolled her eyes. "Oh, you noticed? I thought they were loving my presence." He chuckled. "You're good, Sarah. Better than many here. But that also means some people will try to bring you down." She narrowed her eyes. Are you trying to scare me? No, I'm preparing you. She sighed. Don't worry. I've been through worse. Nicholas watched her for a moment before smiling. Good, because I have a feeling things are about to get even more interesting around here. Sarah grinned. Can't wait. She turned to leave, but Nicholas called her back. Oh, one more thing. She stopped and looked at him. What? He tossed a folder her way. Your next challenge. This time, I want you to present a solution directly to the client. Sarah glanced at the folder, then back at him. You really enjoy testing me, don't you? Nicholas smiled. And you really enjoy surprising me. She held onto the folder and walked out, feeling like this was just the beginning of something much bigger than she had imagined. Nicholas watched her go, a smile on his face. This was going to be fun. Sarah didn't know it yet, but she had just become a key player in the office, and some people weren't going to like it one bit. But one thing was certain. She wasn't going to back down. She never did. Sarah left Nicholas's office, feeling the weight of the folder in her hands. This new challenge wasn't just about proving her technical skills. It was also about navigating the growing tension in the office. Ever since she had started working there, she had noticed the suspicious glances and hushed whispers in the hallways. Some thought she was a joke, others saw her as a threat. She tried not to care. At her desk, she carefully opened the folder and started reading through the documents. The case was a contractual dispute between a company and a supplier, with the company claiming a breach of contract. They wanted to terminate the agreement without paying compensation, arguing that the supplier had missed deadlines. The problem? The contract wasn't as clear as it should have been, leaving loopholes that could be interpreted in favor of either party. Sarah took a deep breath. This wasn't going to be easy. She needed to prepare her argument carefully. There was no room for mistakes. If she failed, it would give her critics exactly what they wanted, an excuse to claim she didn't belong there. She spent the entire morning analyzing the contract, taking notes, and cross-referencing details with other documents. It wasn't just about knowing the law. It was about understanding how the wording could be used to the client's advantage. Before she knew it, lunchtime had arrived. She got up and headed to the office cafeteria, where groups of lawyers sat around tables, deep in conversation. As soon as she walked in, she felt their eyes on her. Some ignored her completely, while others whispered behind her back. She grabbed a coffee and a sandwich, trying to tune out the murmurs, until Hader's voice rang out loud and clear. So, is the office's rising star already preparing for her big disaster? Sarah took a deep breath before turning to face him. Hader was sitting with two other lawyers, both of whom chuckled quietly. If by big disaster you mean my inevitable success, then yes, I'm preparing, she replied coolly. His colleagues laughed, but Hader kept his eyes locked on her. Let's see if Nicholas keeps protecting you after you make a major mistake. Sarah took a sip of her coffee and smiled. Funny, Hader. You seem very concerned about my career. Maybe you should focus on your own. Or are you afraid of being left behind? The laughter at his table stopped. Hader's expression darkened, but he said nothing. Sarah simply smiled and walked away, feeling like she had won another small battle. Back at her desk, she spent the afternoon refining her argument. She knew she had built a strong case, but everything needed to be perfect. By the time she finished, it was nearly the end of the workday. She headed to Nicholas's office, knocked on the door, and stepped inside. He looked up from his computer and smiled. So, are you ready? Sarah placed the folder on his desk. Yes, and I think the client will like what I've put together. Nicholas picked up the papers and started reading. As he went through them, his smile grew. You pinpointed exactly where the weaknesses were. Strong argument. Sarah crossed her arms. So, when's the meeting? Nicholas checked his watch. Tomorrow morning. Hope you're prepared. She smirked. I always am. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office earlier than usual. She reviewed her materials one last time before heading to the conference room. Nicholas was already there, along with the client, Mr. Wallace, a sharp-eyed middle-aged businessman. Mr. Wallace, this is Sarah Evans, my assistant. She'll be presenting the case analysis, Nicholas said. Wallace raised an eyebrow. Her? Are you sure? Sarah held back a smile. She was used to this kind of reaction. "I'm sure, Mr. Wallace. And by the end of this meeting, you will be too." He looked intrigued but nodded. Sarah opened her folder and began her presentation. She methodically explained the contract's weak points, highlighted flaws in the supplier's arguments, and proposed a strategy that would put Wallace's company in a strong position without violating any clauses. When she finished, the room fell silent. Wallace studied the papers in front of him for a moment before finally smiling. "Impressive. You've got talent, young lady." Nicholas grinned. "Told you she was good." Sarah kept her professional demeanor, but inside, she felt a rush of satisfaction. She had nailed it. Wallace stood up and extended his hand. "I'm convinced. Let's go with this strategy." Sarah shook his hand firmly. "Great choice." After the meeting, Nicholas waited until everyone had left before turning to her with a satisfied smile. "You really enjoy surprising people, don't you?" She shrugged. "I just do my job." He nodded. "Keep it up, Evans." Sarah walked out of the room, feeling accomplished. But she knew this was only the beginning. If she really wanted to establish herself, she would have to keep proving her worth every single day. And that's exactly what she intended to do. Sarah sighed as she sank into her chair, feeling the weight of the day lift off her shoulders. Lena, who was busy organizing some papers at the desk next to hers, glanced over with an amused smile. "You look victorious. What happened?" Sarah grinned. "Let's just say another client underestimated me," and walked away impressed. Lena chuckled. "This is becoming a habit." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "I hope so. But I get the feeling that the more I succeed, the more certain people around here get uncomfortable." Lena paused, then let out a sigh. "You're not wrong. A lot of people don't think you belong here. But you know the good part." "What's that?" "They only feel threatened because you're really good." Sarah chuckled. "That's one way to look at it." Before she could say more, a notification popped up on her screen. A meeting request for later that afternoon. The subject line read, "Team Performance Evaluation." Sarah frowned. "Is this normal?" Lena glanced at the screen and sighed. "Not exactly. Evaluations happen, but they're usually one-on-one with supervisors. A group meeting like this? Feels suspicious." Sarah immediately sensed this wasn't just a routine review. It was likely Hayter, or another lawyer, trying to put her on the spot. Nicholas suddenly appeared, as if reading her thoughts. "I saw you got called into the meeting." Sarah nodded. "Any idea what they're up to?" Nicholas crossed his arms. "I have a strong hunch. They're trying to make it look like hiring you was a mistake." Sarah took a deep breath. "Think they'll succeed?" Nicholas smirked. "No, because they still don't know who they're dealing with." Sarah grinned. "I like that confidence." Nicholas handed her a file. "Before the meeting, go over this. It's a case that might interest you." She opened the document. It was a wrongful termination lawsuit. The case involved an employee being dismissed without cause or prior notice. But the most interesting part? The lawyer responsible for the violation was none other than Hayter Reynolds. Sarah let out a quiet laugh. "Are you giving me ammunition?" Nicholas raised an eyebrow. "I'm just providing knowledge. What you do with it is up to you." Sarah already knew exactly what she was going to do with it. The conference room was packed when Sarah walked in. Hayter sat at the front, flanked by two senior attorneys, probably there as backup. Nicholas entered right behind her, taking a seat in the corner, silently observing. Mr. Barnes, one of the senior lawyers, cleared his throat. "We're here to discuss team performance and ways to improve our internal processes." Sarah knew that was just an excuse. Hayter was the first to speak. "I think we need to talk about hiring assistants without proper credentials." Silence filled the room. Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Are you referring to me, Hayter?" He smirked. "If the shoe fits." Sarah chuckled. "Interesting, because I could say the same about lawyers who lose cases due to poor argumentation." Hayter's smirk faltered. "What are you talking about?" Sarah calmly pulled out the document Nicholas had given her and slid it across the table. "This case. Your client lost because you failed to properly contest the contract termination." Hayter picked up the file, his face turning red. This has nothing to do with this meeting. Sarah smiled. Oh, but it does. You're questioning my place here while you have a history of costly mistakes. Mr. Barnes cleared his throat, looking uncomfortable. Hayter, do you have anything to say about this case? Hayter swallowed hard. It was a small mistake. Sarah shook her head. Small. The client lost thousands of dollars. If it were me, I would have spotted the loophole before the deal was even signed. Nicholas remained silent, but the amused glint in his eyes said he was enjoying the moment. Mr. Barnes sighed. I think we can conclude that Miss Evans is making a valuable contribution to the firm. This meeting is adjourned. Sarah watched as Hayter's expression darkened, but he had no choice but to accept defeat. As everyone left the room, Nicholas approached her. You played that well. Sarah smiled. You gave me the cards. He shrugged. And you knew exactly when to use them. Sarah glanced at Hayter as he stormed out, slamming the door behind him. I don't think he's going to give up that easily. Nicholas grinned. Even better for us. The more they try to take you down, the stronger you'll become. Sarah took a deep breath. I do love a good challenge. She knew this battle was far from over, but one thing was certain. She wasn't just some temporary hire. She was here to stay, and no one was going to stop her. Ever since she had dismantled Hayter's attempt to discredit her, the stares at the office had intensified. She could tell that some lawyers were just waiting for her to make the slightest mistake, so they could use it against her. But if they thought she would back down under pressure, they were in for a surprise. That morning, as soon as she entered the office, Lena approached her with a worried look. I just heard something strange. Sarah raised an eyebrow as she grabbed a cup of coffee. Strange how? Lena glanced around, lowering her voice. Hayter is up to something. He wants to use the next negotiation meeting with an important client to expose you. Sarah smirked. Of course he does. What's his plan? He's hoping to put you on the spot in front of the client, expecting you to mess up. Sarah took a sip of her coffee, completely unfazed. Then he's in for a surprise. Lena blinked. You seem really calm. Sarah chuckled. He wants me to fail. Well, I'm going to shine. Nicholas appeared at the door, holding a folder. Evans, we have a meeting in an hour. I want you to lead the contractual part. Sarah smiled. Consider it done. Nicholas studied her for a moment before a smile crossed his lips. I knew I'd like having you here. An hour later, Sarah walked into the conference room. Nicholas was already seated beside their client, Mr. Allen, the owner of a major tech company finalizing a contract with a key supplier. Across the table sat the supplier's lawyers, and, of course, Hayter, looking far too smug. Sarah took a seat next to Nicholas and opened her folder. Shall we begin? Mr. Callahan, one of the supplier's representatives, glanced at Nicholas before looking at Sarah. She's leading the negotiation? Nicholas nodded. Trust me, she's the best person for the job. Hayter smirked, clearly waiting for Sarah to slip up. Let's see how the firm's new rising star performs. Sarah ignored his tone and looked directly at the supplier's lawyers. We've reviewed the contract and identified a few points that need to be adjusted before proceeding. She picked up one of the documents, circling a paragraph with her pen. This clause here is ambiguous. If we leave it as is, both parties could interpret it differently in case of a dispute. That's a risk we don't want to take. The supplier's lawyers exchanged glances, suddenly looking a lot less confident. Sarah flipped the page and pointed to the revised section. We've adjusted the wording to make sure any changes to the contract's scope have to be formally documented and signed by both parties. This prevents misunderstandings and keeps everything transparent. Mr. Callahan reviewed the document and nodded. That makes sense. Hayter leaned back in his chair, but the supplier might want the flexibility to make adjustments without having to go through a formal process for every little change. Sarah remained calm. That wouldn't be in our client's best interest. Too much flexibility could create loopholes for changes that weren't originally agreed upon. Nicholas crossed his arms, satisfied. Exactly. The supplier's lawyers exchanged murmurs among themselves. The senior lawyer adjusted his glasses and finally said, We can agree to that change, but only if the penalty clause is reduced by 10%. Sarah gave a composed smile. Reducing the penalty weakens the contract for our client. But we can compromise. We keep the full penalty, but offer a longer grace period for adjustments, as long as they're communicated in advance. The supplier's lawyers reviewed the proposal. After a few moments, they nodded. That seems fair. Mr. Callahan smiled. I like this approach. Let's move forward with it. Hayter's expression darkened. Sarah glanced at him and gave a small wink. Anything else you'd like to add, Hayter? He let out a frustrated sigh. Nothing. Nicholas smiled. Then we have a deal. As the meeting wrapped up, Hayter left the room without a word. Nicholas turned to Sarah, crossing his arms. I told you I'd like having you here. Sarah smiled. And I told you I was going to shine. Nicholas chuckled. This war between you two is just beginning. Sarah gathered her papers and walked out, knowing she was pushing the right buttons. And that only fueled her motivation. The battle wasn't over, but if Hayter and his allies wanted to play games, she was more than ready to win. As Sarah left the meeting, she felt victorious. Hayter's furious expression was proof that he had tried to take her down, and failed miserably. But she knew people like him never gave up after just one setback. He'd come back with something more calculated, and she needed to be prepared. Back at her desk, Lena approached with a worried look. Sarah, I heard a rumor, and I think you should know about it. Sarah crossed her arms. The kind that says the new girl doesn't belong here? Or the kind that says they're planning to sabotage me? Lena sighed. The second one. Hayter and a few other lawyers are plotting to put you in a tough spot. They're working on a new contract and planning to slip in a mistake, hoping you'll sign it without noticing. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Do they really think I'm that careless? They're counting on your confidence, Lena said. Hayter wants you to feel secure enough not to double-check a tiny detail. By the time you realize it, it'll be too late. Sarah let out a quiet laugh. So they want me to fail because of my own arrogance. Lena nodded. Basically. Sarah gave a calculated smile. Perfect, because I already know exactly how to fight back. Lena blinked. You already have a plan? Not yet, but it's only a matter of time. If they think they'll catch me off guard, they're going to regret it. Lena smirked. I like your fighting spirit. Sarah grinned. And I like watching fools fall into their own traps. Sarah spent the rest of the morning working, but she knew she had to stay one step ahead. If Hayter wanted her to sign a faulty contract, the smartest move was to play along, until the perfect moment to turn the tables. That afternoon, Nicholas called her into his office. You know Hayter and his group are up to something, right? Sarah dropped into the chair and crossed her legs. I know. I'm just waiting for their move. Nicholas smirked. And what's your plan? Let them dangle the bait. When they think they've caught me, I'll make sure they hang themselves with their own rope. Nicholas chuckled. Should I start worrying about you? Sarah shrugged. Only if you're on the wrong side of the story. He was silent for a moment, then nodded. Do what you need to do. Just make sure that when the dust settles, Hayter has no choice but to accept that you're here to stay. Sarah stood up and smirked. I always do. The next morning, the office felt strangely quiet, as if everyone was waiting for something to happen. Sarah noticed immediately, but acted as if it were just another ordinary day. She grabbed a coffee and settled at her desk. Minutes later, Lena appeared with an envelope. Hayter just sent this to you. Sarah took the envelope without rush, opened it, and scanned the papers. By the second paragraph, she had already spotted the trap. They had subtly altered a clause, so that if signed as is, the client would unknowingly waive their right to financial compensation. The change was small, almost imperceptible to someone not paying close attention. Their plan was for her to sign it without noticing, and once the mistake was revealed, she'd take the blame. Sarah let out a deep sigh. They could at least be more creative. Lena widened her eyes. You caught it that fast. Easily. But I'm going to pretend I didn't. Let's see how far they take this. Lena grinned. So the game has officially started. It has. Sarah grabbed a pen, pretended to review the contract, then scribbled a comment next to the altered clause. Obvious mistake. Clause 5.4 contradicts Article 12.2. Please review before sending for final signature. She folded the paper and handed it back to Lena. Give this back to Hader. Lena laughed. I'd love to see his face when he reads this. If you have a hidden camera, let me know. She walked off to deliver the document, and Sarah returned to work. Less than 20 minutes later, Hader appeared beside her desk. Can we talk? Sarah looked up with a falsely innocent smile. Something wrong, Hader? He pressed his lips together. You made a note on the contract. I think you misunderstood something. Sarah blinked. Misunderstood? What do you mean? Hader took a deep breath, clearly trying to stay patient. The clause you pointed out isn't wrong. Sarah picked up the papers, pretending to be confused. Oh wow, you're right. I read it too quickly. But you know what's funny? I almost signed it without noticing. Someone distracted could have easily missed it. Imagine that. Hader crossed his arms. Do you think I'm trying to trick you? Sarah smiled. Me? Of course not. But look, I think this clause could be rewritten to avoid any misunderstandings. What do you think? He was silent for a moment, then picked up the papers and walked away without another word. Lena showed up right after, trying not to laugh. Hader walked out of here, looking like he swallowed a lemon. Sarah smirked. He'll think twice before trying that again. Lena leaned to the side, watching intently. You're handling this better than I expected. Honestly, I'm really enjoying this. Meanwhile, Sarah had just picked up a new contract and started reviewing it. Stick around, she said, flipping through the pages. I'm sure there will be plenty more to see. And she was right. Hader might have failed this time, but he wasn't the type to give up. The only difference now was that he understood Sarah wasn't easy to beat. She was a formidable opponent, and if he wanted to play, she would play, and she would win. Sarah knew Hader wouldn't back down so easily. After his embarrassment in the meeting and his failed attempt to get her to sign a flawed contract, he was bound to come up with something new. The only question was, what? The morning at the office was hectic. Nicholas was out for an external meeting, which meant Sarah might actually get some peace and quiet. Or so she thought. Just as she settled down to review the new contract, Lena appeared beside her, looking concerned. You won't believe what I just heard. Sarah sighed and set her pen down. Let me guess, Hader? Lena nodded. Yes, he's telling everyone you made a mistake in Mr. Callahan's case. Sarah narrowed her eyes. What do you mean? Lena pulled up a chair and leaned in, lowering her voice. He's spreading a rumor that your contract clause left the client vulnerable to a legal dispute. He claims that if the rival company wants to, they can use it against Mr. Callahan and demand a renegotiation. Sarah chuckled. Interesting, because if he actually found a real issue, he would have gone straight to Nicholas instead of spreading rumors. Lena smirked. I know, but that doesn't mean he won't try something serious. He wants to force you to defend yourself in front of everyone. Sarah crossed her arms. Great. Then he's in for another surprise. A few minutes later, an email landed in everyone's inbox. Callahan contract review. Emergency meeting at 3 p.m. Attendance required for Sarah Evans. Lena's eyes widened. He's trying to put you on the spot in front of the entire office. Sarah calmly took a sip of her coffee. Then let's see him try. At exactly 3 p.m., Sarah walked into the conference room. As expected, the room was packed. Nicholas had returned from his meeting and was sitting calmly, while Hader stood by Barnes and a group of lawyers who looked eager for the spectacle. Without a trace of nerves, Sarah grabbed a notepad and took her seat. Barnes cleared his throat. We're here to discuss a concern raised by Mr. Hader Reynolds regarding the review of Mr. Callahan's contract. Nicholas remained neutral. And what exactly is the concern? Hader smirked. The clause proposed by Evans allows for an interpretative loophole that could be used against our client if the opposing party challenges it. This puts Mr. Callahan at risk. Sarah feigned surprise and picked up a document. Oh wow, that sounds terrible. Now tell me, Hader, what exactly is this so-called loophole? Hader grabbed a paper and pointed to a paragraph. Here, The contract states that changes must be formally documented, but if the opposing party refuses to put them in writing and instead makes informal changes, they could argue they weren't bound to comply. Sarah held back a smile. You're right. They could argue that. Hayter crossed his arms, feeling victorious. So you admit you made a mistake? Sarah gave a calm smile. No. I admit that you didn't read the entire contract. The room fell silent. She slid another document across the table. If you had read the section on contract amendments, you'd see there's a clause requiring all changes to be formally documented to be legally valid. That means the opposing party can't refuse to register changes without invalidating the contract itself. Hayter's face froze. Nicholas finally spoke. So, the loophole he found doesn't actually exist? Sarah shrugged. Only in his imagination. A murmur spread across the room. Barnes picked up the document, skimmed through it, and sighed. Well then, there's nothing to discuss. The contract was drafted correctly. Hayter clenched his fists and stood up. That doesn't mean there wasn't carelessness. Sarah smiled. You're right, because you clearly forgot to read the whole document. Nicholas chuckled. Barnes slammed the folder shut. Meeting adjourned. Hayter stormed out, while Sarah calmly gathered her papers. Nicholas walked over, grinning. You really enjoy making them furious, don't you? Sarah blinked innocently. Me? No way. Nicholas shook his head. If you keep this up, they're going to start having nightmares about you. She laughed. I hope so. After the meeting, Sarah returned to her desk, with Lena by her side. Hayter's completely humiliated. Lena whispered. But Sarah, this isn't over. Sarah nodded. I know. He's losing the game, and he's going to try something riskier. Lena glanced around as if expecting Hayter to appear at any moment. Just be careful. Always. A few hours later, Sarah received a new email. This time, it was about a real and urgent case. Evans, I need you to review this contract by tomorrow morning. I trust your work. Nicholas ***. She opened the attachment and started reading. But as she went through the clauses, her expression changed. Something was wrong. She read it again. And again. Her stomach twisted. There was a mistake. But this time, it wasn't one of Hayter's tricks. It was real. And if it went unnoticed, it could cost the client millions. She grabbed a pen and started marking the text. There was work to do. And this time, the stakes were higher than ever. Sarah read and reread the contract. The mistake was staring her in the face, but fixing it wouldn't be easy. The clause was ambiguous, and depending on how it was interpreted, it could lead to massive financial losses for the client. She took a deep breath, massaging her temples. This wasn't one of Hayter's traps. This was serious. And worse, Nicholas had said he trusted her. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. The office was nearly empty when Nicholas walked over to her desk. He stood there in silence for a few moments before speaking. Still here. Sarah didn't look up. This is serious, Nicholas. He pulled up a chair and sat next to her, picking up one of the documents. Show me. She slid the contract over and pointed to the problematic clause. Here. Depending on how this is interpreted, our client could be forced to pay massive settlements without even being at fault. Nicholas read it carefully, his brow furrowing. Damn, this is worse than I thought. She nodded. What if we just remove this part? He shook his head. We can't. The client demanded this clause. They want protection against unexpected contract terminations. If we take it out, they won't accept the deal. Sarah leaned back in her chair, thinking. Then we need to rewrite it, keep their protection, but make sure there are no loopholes for disputes. Nicholas studied her, a small smile playing on his lips. You take this very seriously. She rolled her eyes. Isn't that the job? He chuckled. Yes, but most people just do the bare minimum. You actually care. She held back a smile. I'm not most people. He tilted his head slightly, watching her. I know. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down her spine. She quickly looked away, refocusing on the contract. Let's fix this before I regret working this late. Grinning, Nicholas leaned over the table. Let's do it. 2 hours later, Sarah and Nicholas were still buried in paperwork, surrounded by stacks of notes, half-empty coffee cups, and multiple drafts of the contract. "Okay, what if we tweak this part?" Sarah suggested, scribbling on the paper. "This way, the client keeps their protection against terminations, but it's clear that the clause can only be triggered under specific conditions." Nicholas read over the revision and nodded. "That works." Sarah let out a deep sigh and leaned back in her chair. Finally, Nicholas chuckled, leaning back beside her. "You did well." She glanced at him, exhaustion weighing on her. "Thanks, but if you ever drop another one of these last-minute bombs on me before 2 a.m., at least give me a heads up." He laughed. "I'll try." For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence. The office was nearly empty, the only light coming from the soft glow of the desk lamps. It was oddly peaceful. That's when Sarah realized how close they were. Nicholas seemed to notice too. His gaze lingered on her, more intense than usual. Clearing her throat, she quickly stood up. "Well, I guess we can submit this in the morning." Nicholas blinked a few times before smiling. "Yes, we can." She grabbed her bag, trying to ignore the strange tension in the air. "All right then. See you tomorrow." Nicholas nodded. "See you tomorrow, Evans." As Sarah walked out of the office, her heart pounded a little harder than it should. That was strange. Very strange. But what unsettled her most wasn't just the moment. It was the way Nicholas had looked at her. That scared her more than any poorly written contract ever could. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the office to find Nicholas already in the meeting room, presenting the revised contract to the client. Slipping in quietly, she took a seat beside him. Mr. Carter, the client, flipped through the pages carefully. "So, you adjusted this clause to give me better protection?" Sarah nodded. "Exactly. This ensures your company won't be vulnerable to misinterpretation while maintaining strong contractual security." The man studied the document for a few moments, then smiled. "This is exactly what I needed." Nicholas crossed his arms, looking satisfied. "So, can we move forward with the signing?" Without hesitation, the client picked up the pen and signed. Sarah let out a quiet sigh of relief, another problem solved. Once the meeting ended, Nicholas pulled her aside. "You saved this contract, Evans." She smirked. It was either that, or let our client lose millions. Nicholas gave her a look like he wanted to say more. "You really are different from anyone who's ever worked here." She raised an eyebrow. "Different in a good way or a bad way?" He smiled. "Very good." Sarah blinked a few times, then looked away. "Well, I'm glad to hear that." Nicholas held her gaze for a moment longer, as if debating whether to say something else, but then he simply smiled and walked away. Sarah stood there alone, trying to make sense of what was happening, and why. For the first time since she started working there, she had no argument against what she was feeling. Lately, Sarah couldn't stop thinking about the way Nicholas looked at her. It was becoming a problem, not because it was uncomfortable, but because it was dangerous. She wasn't here to get distracted or caught up with the boss. She was here to prove herself, to silence Hayer and every other lawyer who still doubted her. But Nicholas was becoming a distraction that was hard to ignore. That morning, while grabbing coffee in the office kitchen, Lena appeared beside her with a knowing smirk. "So, you and Nicholas, what's going on?" Sarah nearly choked on her coffee. "What?" Lena laughed. "Oh, come on. I saw the way he looked at you in the meeting yesterday, and I saw how quickly you looked away." Sarah huffed, trying to ignore the warmth creeping up her face. "There's nothing going on." Lena raised an eyebrow. "Right. So it's just my imagination telling me there's chemistry between you two." Sarah sighed, taking a sip of her coffee. "I don't know what you think you saw, but I can't afford to even consider this right now." Lena crossed her arms. "Maybe you don't want to think about it, but I think Nicholas already is." Sarah rolled her eyes and walked away before Lena could push the topic any further. But deep down, she couldn't shake the question, what if Lena was right? The day was hectic. Sarah was deep into another major case when Nicholas appeared by her desk. "Can you come to my office?" She looked up and nodded. Of course. When she stepped inside, Nicholas shut the door behind her and leaned against his desk, arms crossed. I got an anonymous complaint. Sarah frowned. A complaint? About what? Wordlessly, Nicholas handed her a document. She scanned the page and felt her stomach tighten. Her name was on it. Someone had sent a report claiming she wasn't qualified to work at the firm, alleging she was hired improperly and didn't meet company standards. Sarah let out a humorless laugh. Seriously? This is their latest move. Nicholas watched her carefully. You know who did this? She took a deep breath. It has to be him. Nicholas nodded. I think so too. But don't worry, this won't go anywhere. Sarah crossed her arms. Are you sure? He smiled. Do you really think I'd let that happen? She held his gaze for a moment. He was really willing to protect her. Thank you, she said, letting her guard down just a little. Nicholas stepped a little closer. You don't have to thank me. I brought you here for a reason, Evans, and I don't regret it. Sarah swallowed, suddenly aware of how close they were. This was dangerous, but as much as she wanted to deny it, she wasn't sure she wanted to step away. Sarah felt her heartbeat speed up slightly. Nicholas was standing too close. She cleared her throat and looked away. Well, I should probably get back to work. Nicholas held back a smile. Yes, but first. She eyed him suspiciously. First what? He picked up a file from his desk and handed it to her. I need you to review this, but I want your honest opinion. Sarah took the papers, raising an eyebrow. You've already read it? Yes, but I want to know what you think. She glanced at the document, then back at him. You really trust my judgment that much? Nicholas shrugged. So far, you've been flawless. Sarah gripped the paper a little tighter. All right, I'll review it and get back to you. Nicholas nodded, but before she could walk away, he said, Evans. She turned. Yes. He smiled. You take everything so seriously. Just don't forget to breathe once in a while. She let out a small laugh. I'll try. As she left, she didn't realize she was still holding her breath. That afternoon, Sarah carefully analyzed the document. It was an important contract, but what really caught her off guard was that Nicholas genuinely wanted her input. He wasn't just testing her. He actually valued her opinion. That realization meant more to her than she was ready to admit. When she finished, she gathered her notes and walked to his office. Nicholas was alone, reading a report. Here it is, she said, handing him the papers. He took them, flipping through the pages and scanning her notes. You found a mistake here. Sarah nodded. Yes, a subtle contradiction in the penalty clause. Nicholas smiled. Well done. She crossed her arms. So, did I pass the test? He looked up at her. This wasn't a test. I genuinely wanted your input. Sarah was silent for a moment. Thank you. Nicholas smiled. No, thank you. She realized he was looking at her again, that same way that made her heart race. Clearing her throat, she took a step back. Well, if you need anything else, I'll be at my desk. Nicholas nodded, but as soon as she left, he smiled to himself. Sarah felt like she was stepping into dangerous territory. The problem was, for the first time, she wasn't sure she wanted to step out of it. Lately, Sarah had become more and more aware of Nicholas's presence. Something was shifting between them, even if neither had the courage to admit it. But the office wasn't a place for distractions, and Nicholas was too big of a distraction. That morning, she tried to focus on her work, ignoring his gaze when he walked past her desk, ignoring the tension that built up whenever they were alone. But ignoring it was hard when Nicholas made sure to be around. Evans. His voice came from beside her. Sarah closed her eyes for a second before turning to him. What is it? He held out a folder and a coffee, as if he knew she hadn't had a decent one yet. I need your help with a case. She took the coffee without hesitation. Is this a bribe? Nicholas smiled. Let's call it an incentive. Sarah scoffed but grabbed the folder and started flipping through the documents. What's the case? Nicholas pulled up a chair and sat next to her. The client wants to terminate a contract without paying a penalty, but the supplier is claiming breach of contract. We need to find a middle ground so that no one gets hurt. Sarah skimmed through the document quickly. This isn't that complicated. There's a loophole here. If they argue the supplier delayed delivery, they can justify termination without a penalty. Nicholas smiled. You have an incredible talent for this. Sarah rolled her eyes. Don't praise me just yet. We need to see if this actually holds up in court. Nicholas watched her for a moment, as if evaluating something beyond the case. You're one of the most determined people I've ever met. Sarah looked away. And you're annoyingly observant. He laughed. I'm a lawyer. It's part of the job. She sighed and grabbed a pen. All right, let's get this done. But even as they worked, Sarah could feel the tension in the air, and she knew it was getting harder and harder to ignore. That night, Sarah stayed late at the office. So did Nicholas. You should go home, he said, leaning against her office door. Sarah let out a sigh. So should you. He smirked. But I'm the boss. She laughed. Does that mean you get to ignore common sense? He stepped inside and sat across from her. It means I can work late without anyone questioning me. Sarah crossed her arms. Except me. Nicholas studied her for a moment before saying, Except you. The silence that followed was too intense. Sarah glanced down at the papers on her desk. I really need to finish this. Sarah. She froze. He rarely called her by her first name. Nicholas seemed to be struggling with his words. Before he could continue, his phone rang. He picked it up, and his expression changed. I have to take this. Sarah nodded quickly, relieved by the interruption. But part of her knew that sooner or later, that conversation would happen, and she wasn't sure if she was ready for it. The next day, the office was buzzing with activity. Lena rushed to Sarah's desk, looking frantic. You won't believe this. Sarah, exhausted, looked up. What now? Nicholas has a business dinner tonight with an important client. And guess who he invited to join him? Sarah blinked. Who? Lena grinned. You. Sarah's stomach twisted. What? He said he wants you there. Said your presence is essential for the negotiation. Sarah took a deep breath. This isn't a date. It's just work. Lena laughed. Sure. Sarah ignored her and went back to work. But now, her heart was beating way too fast. And she didn't know if it was because of the dinner, or because, for the first time, she couldn't see Nicholas as just her boss. Sarah kept telling herself it was just work, but the way Lena smirked at her made it clear that not everyone saw it that way. When the time came, she went home to get ready, choosing a simple yet elegant black dress and styling her hair neatly. She didn't want to seem like she was trying too hard, but she also didn't want to look unprepared. When she arrived at the restaurant, Nicholas was already there. As always, his suit was perfectly tailored, but tonight, he looked more at ease than he did in the office. Evans, he greeted as she walked in. She crossed her arms. Smith, he chuckled, clearly amused. You really can't relax for even a second, can you? Sarah sighed as she took a seat. Not when I'm working with you. Nicholas leaned in slightly. That means I'm doing my job right. Before she could respond, their client arrived, Mr. R.A. Harrington, a major businessman negotiating an important contract with their firm. The dinner started formally, with discussions revolving around business and contracts. Sarah spoke with confidence, proving she had studied every detail. Mr. Harrington seemed impressed. You're very sharp, Miss Evans. Sarah smiled. Thank you, I do my best. Nicholas watched her with something close to pride in his eyes. The meeting went smoothly, but when Mr. Harrington excused himself to use the restroom, Sarah noticed Nicholas looking at her differently. What? She asked. He hesitated before saying, You surprise me more every day. Sarah looked away. I'm not sure if that's a good or a bad thing. Nicholas gave a small smile. Definitely a good thing. She took a deep breath, sensing they were stepping into dangerous territory. Don't mix things up, Nicholas. He raised an eyebrow. And what exactly am I mixing up? Sarah narrowed her eyes. You know. Nicholas was silent for a moment before sighing. You always have an answer for everything, don't you? She smirked. It's my job. The dinner ended successfully, with the contract practically sealed. As Mr. Harrington left, Nicholas turned to Sarah. Do you want me to drive you home? She hesitated. No need, I can go on my own. He smiled. I know you can, but that doesn't mean I can't offer. She studied him for a moment before sighing. All right. The car ride was quiet, heavy with unspoken thoughts. Finally, Nicholas broke the silence. You feel it, don't you? Sarah knew exactly what he meant, but she pretended otherwise. Feel what? He glanced at her before focusing back on the road. Whatever this is between us. She took a deep breath. Nicholas, don't tell me I'm imagining things. Sarah stayed silent. He wasn't imagining anything. After a moment, Nicholas sighed. Got it. She wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. When they reached her place, Sarah got out without speaking. But before going inside, she looked back. Nicholas was still sitting there, watching her with something unreadable in his eyes. And she knew, no matter how much she tried to avoid it, something between them had already changed. And the next day, nothing would be the same. Sarah woke up with a weight on her chest. The night before kept replaying in her mind. She tried to push the thoughts away, but Nicholas's words echoed in her head. You feel it, don't you? Yes, she did, but admitting it would change everything. She had worked too hard to prove herself at the firm, especially against people like Hector. If Nicholas became part of the equation, things would get even more complicated. At the office, she did her best to act normal, but when her eyes met Nicholas's, she knew he hadn't forgotten their conversation. He walked over, his voice quiet. Can we talk? Sarah hesitated. I'm busy right now. Then later. She sighed. Nicholas. He crossed his arms. You can keep pretending nothing is happening, but I won't. A chill ran down her spine. He never spoke like this. No teasing remark, no smirk, no sharp comeback, just seriousness. Before she could respond, Lena rushed in. Sarah, we have a problem. Sarah silently thanked the interruption. What is it? Here. Sarah immediately went on high alert. What did he do now? Lena handed her a document. He filed a formal complaint against you with the board. He's claiming your hiring was irregular and that you don't have the necessary qualifications. Nicholas snatched the paper and skimmed through it. This is ridiculous. Sarah crossed her arms. He really wants to take me down. Lena sighed. The problem is, he got a meeting with Barnes to discuss it. Sarah frowned. When? In an hour. She closed her eyes for a second, then took a deep breath. Then let's settle this once and for all. At the meeting, Here wore a smug smile. All I'm asking is for Evans's hiring to be reviewed. Barnes turned to Sarah. What do you have to say about this? She crossed her arms. That this is nothing but a personal attack, because I proved I'm better than him. Here laughed. Oh sure, this has nothing to do with your questionable credentials. Nicholas stepped in. If the issue is credentials, we can provide Evans's academic records and her performance evaluations. Sarah slid a folder across the table. Here it is. Barnes opened the documents and read through them. The room was silent. Sarah waited. Here waited. Nicholas waited. Finally, Barnes closed the folder and looked at Here. Your complaint is unfounded. Miss Evans was hired on merit and has demonstrated more than enough competence for her position. There's nothing more to discuss. Sarah smiled. Here, on the other hand, was furious. This is absurd. Barnes gave him a cold stare. What's absurd is you wasting the board's time with a baseless complaint. If you want to stay in this firm, I suggest you focus on your own work instead of attacking your colleagues. Hayter clenched his jaw but had no choice except to accept defeat. Nicholas looked at Sarah with a proud smile. I told you. No one was going to take you down. She took a deep breath. Thank you. Barnes stood up. This meeting is over. Sarah gathered her documents and walked out, Nicholas by her side. Once they reached the hallway, he gently grabbed her arm. Can we talk now? She looked at him. Nicholas. He gave a small smile. If you want to keep running from this, I can let it go. But I'm going to ask you one last time. She swallowed hard. Ask what? He took a step closer. This time, Sarah didn't back away. Do you feel this as much as I do? She stayed silent, but in that moment, she saw everything. The times Nicholas had supported her, Every glance they'd exchanged, every heartbeat that had quickened because of him. She could keep denying it, or she could finally accept it. Taking a deep breath, she looked into his eyes. Yes. Nicholas smiled. Finally. Sarah rolled her eyes. You're impossible. He laughed, and before she could say another word, he cupped her face and kissed her. In that instant, the world around them faded. Sarah didn't know where this would lead, but for the first time, she was ready to find out. She had never believed in fairy tales. She had always fought her battles alone, guarding herself against hurt. But there, in Nicholas's arms, with his lips on hers, she realized she had found something she never thought possible. His kiss was filled with an intensity that made her heart race, as if all the tension between them had finally broken free. When they pulled apart, Nicholas rested his forehead against hers, a satisfied smile on his lips. I've waited a long time for this. Still catching her breath, Sarah looked at him. And now that you have it. He held her face gently. Now I want more. She smiled, feeling lighter than ever. Then I guess we're on the same page. Nicholas chuckled and kissed her again, slower this time. The office could wait. The world could wait. In that moment, it was just the two of them. Over the following months, their relationship grew naturally. Nicholas respected Sarah's pace, never rushing her, and little by little, she allowed herself to trust him. Of course, the entire office found out. Lena nearly exploded with joy when she heard. I knew it. I knew this would happen. This office was begging for a power couple. Sarah rolled her eyes but laughed. Hader, on the other hand, was furious. But after the humiliation he had endured, he realized he no longer had the strength to fight them. Sarah and Nicholas worked together like an unbeatable team, and for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt truly happy. But Nicholas had a plan. He wanted more, much more. One quiet weekend, he took Sarah out for a special dinner. Any particular occasion? She asked suspiciously as they walked into an upscale restaurant. I just wanted to spoil you a little, he replied with a mysterious smile. Sarah frowned. You never do anything without a reason. He laughed. Blame it on my lawyer instincts. During dinner, Nicholas seemed unusually calm, but Sarah could sense something in the air. Then, when the waiter brought dessert, a small envelope was placed next to her plate. What's this? She asked. Nicholas just smiled. With slight hesitation, Sarah opened the envelope and found a single sheet of paper. As she read, her heart raced. It was a marriage certificate with their names on it. She looked at Nicholas, stunned. What? He stood up, pulled a small box from his pocket, and got down on one knee. The entire restaurant went silent. Sarah Evans, he began, his eyes shining. From the day you walked into that elevator and argued with me, I knew you were different, but I didn't know you would completely change my life. Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes. You taught me to see the world in a new way, to truly care, and you made me realize that nothing is worth it if I can't share it with you. He opened the small box, revealing a stunning ring. So now, in the most cliché yet sincere way possible, will you marry me? Sarah laughed, wiping her eyes. You really used a legal document to propose to me? Nicholas grinned. I thought it was fitting. She looked at him. The man who challenged her, believed in her when no one else did, and became her partner both in and out of the office. Without hesitation, she answered, Yes. Nicholas laughed, sliding the ring onto her finger before pulling her in for a kiss as the restaurant erupted in applause. In that moment, Sarah knew. She was exactly where she was meant to be. A few months later, their wedding day arrived. The ceremony was held in a beautiful garden, decorated with white flowers under a perfect blue sky. Sarah looked stunning in her white dress, holding a delicate bouquet as she walked down the aisle, her eyes locked on Nicholas, who waited at the altar with a loving smile. Lena, her maid of honor, tried to hold back tears. I never thought I'd see Sarah getting married, she whispered. Sarah laughed. Me neither. When she reached the altar, Nicholas gently took her hands. The officiant began the ceremony, but they barely heard a word. They were lost in each other. When it was time for the vows, Nicholas took a deep breath before speaking. Sarah, I never imagined that an argument in an elevator would lead me to you. But looking back, I see it was the best thing that ever happened to me. You made me want to be a better man, and today, in front of everyone, I promise to keep challenging you, supporting you, and loving you for the rest of my life." Sarah held back tears and smiled before saying hers. "Nicholas, you are the most infuriating and charming person I have ever met. From the very beginning, you made me question everything, challenged me, and helped me grow. And now, I can't imagine my life without you. So today, in front of everyone, I promise I will never argue with you in an elevator again." The guests laughed, and so did Nicholas. "But I also promise that I will always stand by your side, no matter what." The officiant smiled. "Nicholas Smith, do you take Sarah Evans as your wife?" "I do." "Sarah Evans, do you take Nicholas Smith as your husband?" She looked at him, her heart racing. "I do." "Then I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Nicholas didn't wait. He pulled Sarah into a passionate kiss as the guests cheered. And in that moment Sarah knew. She had found her place, her home, her love.